welcome to NAPOD, where we provide NA speaker meetings and workshops in a podcast. We are an ad-free podcast, and if you enjoy listening, please help us to be self-supporting by visiting napod.xyz, look for the donate link, and drop $1 or $2 in the virtual basket. If you're also in AA or have friends that are, please tell them about our other podcast, Sobercast. Sobercast features AA speakers and workshops in the same format as NAPOD. We upload a new speaker every day, and it's easy to subscribe by searching for Sobercast, that's 2 words, on any podcast player app, or go to Sobercast.com. Enjoy the podcast, and thanks for listening.
Okay, the 15th of January, 2006, and the Sunday Night Speakers Meeting of Narcotics Anonymous welcomes our second speaker, Ben.
Woo! Yeah. All right. Thanks, Jim.
You bet.
I'm Ben. I'm an addict.
Okay, Ben.
Oh, thanks for sharing, Jennifer. Today as I was preparing for this, getting myself nervous, it seems like it's been a while since I've spoke anywhere, and I was thinking I have a phone line commitment now, which is it's a pretty cool commitment, and it's an every week thing, and I get people calling me, all kinds of people, and for years before that I used to do H&I, and one of the nice things about H&I is, fairly regularly I would have to share my story, which would kind of make me think about it. And, I've been clean for 16 years now, and it's actually been, quite a bit longer than I used for me. And it's a long time ago. And, of course, when I first got clean, it was all fresh in my mind. Now it's not so fresh. And but sometimes, from this distance, I see things differently, which is always interesting. In any case, I'm not from California. I'm from New York. And I grew up in Greenwich Village in Manhattan, for the most part. And my family, it's just me and my brother, just 2 of us, and they're basically my immediate family is a family of normies. No one in my family uses drugs. And so I was not brought up around with any examples of people who used. And my parents are both immigrants, they're English, and so I didn't have any of my extended family to see if any of them used either. My mom was a homemaker. And, my dad was a hard-working guy who provided well for us. I grew up in a real nice, by and large, real nice environment. My parents are loving. They're English. They have a bit of the stiff upper lip. There's not a lot of feelings talked about in my home. I didn't learn how to deal with my feelings growing up. And, I didn't really use any drugs through most of my childhood, really, until I went to college. And I started using when I was 18, when I went off to college. I had no reason to use drugs, except that I liked them. In retrospect. When I got clean, I thought I had some reasons. And when I, early on, when I remember when I first started hearing people share at meetings, and a lot of the things that people shared about resonated with me. The feelings of feeling apart, not a part of, and not knowing how to deal with my feelings, not even really knowing what they were most of the time. I didn't even know I had them, to be honest with you, by and large. I remember when I first got here and people would talk about, well, you're going to be having feelings, and I didn't know what they were talking about. I think it took me quite a few months of being clean before I really started having feelings. I had learned how to suppress my feelings before I ever used drugs. That's what I did with them before I started using. That's what I did with the things that I didn't know what to do with in my life, is I just ignored them, and I got really good at it, actually. So when I started using, like I said, I grew up in Greenwich Village, and I kind of grew up with the idea that drugs were better than that illegal drugs were better for you than legal ones. This was kind of an anti-establishment place when I was a kid, and those were kind of the kind of people that my parents, even though they're like really kind of straight arrows and pretty square, those were the kind of people that they hung out with. And when I first started using, I didn't really go to bars much, although they're pretty popular in New York. And I thought that liquor was a more evil drug than the ones that I was using. And when I first got here, I was worried about that part of thing of not knowing if I belonged or not. And I didn't really use hard drugs, what they call hard drugs, which I guess is heroin. I don't know what other drugs are hard drugs. Anyway, I'm not exactly sure. But anyway, of course, I was scared that what I used wasn't appropriate to the fellowship I was going to. And I suppose everyone is, And since I got here, it's one of the things I really like about NA is when I read the literature and it said, we don't care what or how much you used, that really attracted me to this fellowship. I've never really been completely sure what my drug of choice was, because I had a bunch of them. So how could any of them have been my drug of choice? And I really know that, if none of those drugs existed, it would have been some other drugs that I used. It really doesn't matter to me. I seem to prefer this one, but I'm sure if it was some completely different drug, that's what I would have been using. There was something about it that really I enjoyed. And I got to say that right away when I started using drugs, it started affecting my life. And, I never really had a lot of overt negative consequences from using. I was going to college. I managed to string that out for 7 years. So most of my using, I was in college. And so I got my parents to support me through a lot of it, because I was in college. And I think it worked pretty well for me, in retrospect, I suppose I kind of figured that one out, at the time. But it did affect my life right away, even though I wasn't necessarily using that heavily. When I first got clean, it seemed to me like the last year or two, and particularly the last few months, were when I was really feeling degraded and feeling like I was doing things completely against my will. Over time, and through writing inventories and talking to people about it and listening to people share, I've come to see how from the very start, drugs started affecting my life all the way from one end to through the entire spectrum of my life. Up until that time, I'd always been a pretty good student, and now I had like something else to do instead of being a student and just a kid, and it really interfered with my schoolwork, and I didn't do nearly as well at school as I could have. And right from the start, I was feeling guilty about that because my dad was paying for it, and I felt like I should be trying to do the best I can. Someone was giving me something for free, but I couldn't seem to not miss the class or blow off doing the paper for a long time. I never did anything on time through my entire college career. I didn't hand in a single paper on time. I always got C's when I could have gotten B's, and I got B's when I could have gotten A's, because and right from the very start, it started affecting the way I thought about myself, because I started feeling like I had no willpower and no discipline, which I didn't. The fact was that if the whim took me, I was going to go party instead of do my schoolwork or go to class. And it affected my my view of myself and what I was doing with my life. I had a really good opportunity, and I made the most of it. I mean, I actually graduated from college, which is kind of amazing, in retrospect. But by the time I got done with that, I had come to the conclusion that I didn't like being in college because I didn't do well at it, and I didn't know that I was an addict. So I just assumed that the reason why I was behaving the way I was is because I didn't like school. And that's the tricky thing about being an addict and not really knowing it, is that, I did things in my life like that, like doing poorly at school. And I thought that the reason I did it is because I didn't like this thing. I thought I had chosen not to do that thing well, And in reality, I was doing something else that I couldn't control that was interfering with that thing. I actually liked learning and going to class and doing that stuff. And, it's been that way with other areas. It's really hard. It's like, in effect, I kind of brainwashed myself into believing something. Being an addict's a real tricky thing that way. And, for me, those drugs, they progressively stopped working, and I would do one drug for whatever and time and years or what have you, and then move on to another one when the first one stopped working. And I didn't know what was going on with me at the time. In retrospect, I can see how that happened for me. That, at some point that particular drug would not give me the relief and the ease that it had previously, and I would pick up a different drug. And after I graduated from college and I started having more money, I was able to spend money and use more drugs. And in a way, I used that thing of not having money as a way to control my using before that. And anyway, it got pretty much out of control to the point where, in my life, I was not able to take care of myself at all. I couldn't pay the rent, and I got kicked out of where I was living. And I went back to my parents' house, and what happened was, my mom actually caught me mixing up my drugs in the toilet. She burst in on me. And all those years I had oftentimes lived with my parents when I was going to college, and they would never do things like that. My parents were real careful not to catch me in anything, And it turns out she had started going to a 12-step program for moms of people like us. So she decided, she had had a certain amount of her denial removed, and she caught me, and it was kind of a trip because I admitted to her that I needed help, and she took me to a meeting. It was my first meeting, and I remember going in that place. I had no idea what was wrong with me. And people identified, and man, I was just amazed, that people apparently had what I had. It's a pretty wild feeling, Like I said, it's been a while for me, and I'm used to the fact that there's a lot of other people like me now. I'm really comfortable with it, and that we're different than other people in a lot of ways. But at that time, I thought I was alone in the world, and I was high when I went to that meeting, and I remember some guy came up to me and said, "Oh, the only requirement is a desire to stop using." He was letting me know it was okay for me to be high. I didn't know what he was talking about. I remember I was like, what does that mean? The requirement, And in any case, I was really glad. I didn't know how to stop using, but I was really glad. My life was miserable at that time. I couldn't seem to do anything, in in any given like 2-hour period, if I wanted to set out to do something, I couldn't do it. I never knew what I would just do. You know, I couldn't like achieve one little thing. I couldn't go shopping for food. All I ever lived on were potato chips. And so I went to a place where a detox facility, and they gave me a copy of the NA Basic Text. I was lying in this bed, so I read the book. I was there for 2 days. I read it through, and I really identified with it. And basically, I've been clean ever since then. That day that I went to that place, and man, I was so grateful to get clean. I have not had any desire or obsession to use since that day. Not a one. I've been glad I was clean the whole time. You know, it was completely apparent to me that there was not one problem in my life that using would not make worse. It always had, you know. I just didn't know how to stop. And somehow, the fact that once I stopped, knowing that there were other people that had stopped, somehow made it possible for me to stay stopped. The one thing that I was really worried about in the basic text was the word God. Really perturbed me. I'm an atheist, and I don't believe in God. And I thought, oh man, what am I going to do? How am I going to do this? And I have to say, that the first year I was clean, I was pretty desperate the first few months. So I asked someone to sponsor me, and I made a bad choice because I didn't ask the guy if he knew anything about working the steps or anything. So he took me to meetings, and he didn't talk to me about the steps. And, then I moved here to California, and I didn't ask anyone to sponsor me. And by then I was feeling like, oh, well, look, this is fine. I don't want to use. I'm doing fine. The drugs are gone. My problems are solved. And, people were talking about having feelings. I was like, well, I don't have it, I'm happy. I smiled a lot. And I felt pretty happy, actually, And besides which, I didn't really want to have to deal with the fact that I was going to have to somehow come to believe in something, in God, apparently. I went to some meetings, and they said with this prayer that sounds very extremely religious, Our Father, blah, blah, blah. Man, I can't stand that. I remember when I first heard the NA Third Step prayer, which doesn't even mention God, I was like, that's the prayer I like. It really worried me, and I have to say that I think that, of course I didn't, if I'd been willing to talk to people about it, maybe I could have started working through that. That whole the thing about God and a higher power, I didn't know how to deal with it, because the only higher power I'd ever heard of was a religious God. Up till coming to NA, that's the only, so I thought that's what they must be talking about in the steps. I noted it said that it said of your own understanding, and it said that we recommend that you choose a higher power that's loving and caring and things like that. But by and large, I thought that was just trying to trick me, into going ahead and going to church or something. And honestly, the fact is, this does have to be a sincere thing, So, finally, after a little over a year, I started realizing that I actually did not know how to deal with my life. And I was real lucky in the fact that my obsession to use was completely lifted. So I didn't relapse during that time. But for me to actually go out and ask for the help I needed, I really had to start realizing that my life was unmanageable. That was just it. On my own, it was clear to me that I was powerless over my addiction, but I did not understand that my life was unmanageable. So I didn't, why get a sponsor if my life's not unmanageable, right? And I didn't really want someone else to know what I was doing in my life. I was still had a fair bit of shame in my life, and in any case, so finally I got desperate enough, and I asked someone to help me, and that was such a relief, boy. That was probably, I've had a few good surrenders since I've been clean, and that was a really big one for me. And I got to tell you, I really struggled with. It took me a couple years to write an inventory, and really the reason why for me is because of a lack of faith. I didn't know how to have faith, and I really needed help from someone to work through that, and it took a while. It just took a while for me to learn how to have the kind of faith that I needed. The writing a fourth step inventories, it was real scary for me to face all that stuff without having something. I really had to take a second and third step properly, and I just couldn't seem to do it for a while. Sometimes I've gone back and read some of the stuff I wrote back then, and I was kind of frantic and freaked out, because I needed to. I remember, my sponsor would say, well, you could just believe that I believe, and he'd say things like that, and it just wasn't enough for me. I needed to have something of my own to be able to face myself, apparently. When I think back about the things that I wrote in my fourth step, now it wasn't that big of a deal, really. None of it. But, when I had never looked at anything in my life before, it was horrifying and terrifying. That's how I maintained, I just didn't know about myself, and I didn't really want to. And finally, somehow or other, and it was just a process, I never had any kind of big revelation. I was finally able to work a third step and get through that stuff. And nowadays for me, I have a pretty solid, faith in a higher power. And there have been times in my recovery when I've been much more. I've sort of carefully identified my higher power and described it. And these days, I find that that's just not that important for me. And and I have found that, and it was one of the things that my sponsor told me early on, that the only thing really important about my higher power is for me to understand that I'm not it. And it's true, by and large, I find that somehow or other, through going to meetings and the process of the steps, I have access to some kind of power that I just don't have on my own, using my own willpower. The reason I share this stuff is I rarely hear people share about being an atheist at meetings. So it's part of my story that's real important, because I've been able to stay clean for 16 years based on the fact that I don't believe in God, and yet I have found access to a higher power, And I'm afraid there are other people out there like me. I struggled with it a lot. I don't feel like I ever really. The fact is from the very start, when I first got to NA, I somehow gained access to a power that I didn't have on my own. When I, by myself, it was really clear to me. I can remember about a week before I got clean, I was running out the door to go score some drugs, and I remember thinking to myself that I had no control over my own feet. I remember it was really clear to me, like just before I got clean, that I was doing something I didn't want to do. And I just didn't know how to stop, you know. And I had never, before that, I had always thought it was my own choice, that this was my preference and my choice. And somehow it finally, and I guess that's one of the things that's made it easy for me to stay clean over the years, was having that realization, even before I got clean, that I was just like I felt literally like a puppet on a string. I felt like something had a string attached to me and was pulling me out my door to go get drugs, you know. And yet, you know, in the course of one day, that which had been controlling me for 10 years just disappeared. You know, and it was not something I was able to do sitting at home by myself ever. In any case, you know, nowadays for me, you know, I really like my life. I like my life clean. I pretty much have the whole time I've been clean, by and large. But it also keeps getting better. You know, there's still things that in my life that I'd like to change and improve. You know, things about myself is what I'm talking about. But, you know, I'm doing a lot better than I ever was. And I get to do a lot of things that I want to do these days. That's the really, that's a real key thing for me. You know, I thought I was doing what I wanted when I was using. But a lot of the time I wasn't. Whenever I was doing what I wanted to do, I had to struggle to do it when I was a using addict. I had to, like, struggle against my disease to do the things that I wanted to do. You know, I still struggle against my disease to do the things that I want to do, but far less than I did before. And there's a lot of things that I've just, you know, learned how to do now that I want to do, and now it's no problem for me. And you know, that's a real relief for me. I just had a baby a few months ago, and I never would have done that before, because now I have some reasonable confidence that I can do, you know, what I need to do for someone else. And you know, I couldn't have done that before. You know, I don't even know if I could have done that 10 years ago or 5 years ago, but I probably could have. You know, I was probably more scared. Maybe I'm just less scared now than I was then. But you know, that's the only reason I undertook that responsibility, because I feel like, you know, I'm still scared that I'm selfish and self-centered, because I am, but I've learned how to overcome a lot of that within me. And you know, I felt like I could overcome it enough to, you know, to be able to take care of a child. So, well, I hope so anyway. So far, so good, you know. I took him down to the beach this morning, and I carried him around on that little thing. It was pretty great, actually. And you know, I watched, it was beautiful down on the beach. I was down there with my wife and my child, and we were watching the surfers. I was, you know, thinking of going surfing, but the water's real dirty. I'm a little scared of that. I try to, you know, look out for my health more than I used to. And but it was a beautiful day. I was sitting down there, and some friends of mine showed up, you know, just wandering by the beach. And man, you know, my life is just great. You know, all of those friends are people I've, you know, well, by and large, friends that I've made in recovery. And you know, I never used to be able to do things like that when I was using. Anyway, thanks for letting me share. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed the podcast. Please help us improve our rankings so others can find us by putting a review on Stitcher, iTunes, or your favorite podcast index. Nawpod is ad-free thanks to the folks supporting the show with $1 or more per month. If you enjoy listening, you can join them by going to nawpod.xyz and looking for the donate link. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.